Hello and welcome to this presentation about quantitative methods, part 2. And I'm talking about the methodologies, research methodologies, views of quantitative methods. So I'm going to be talking about positivism, interpretivism, feminism and realism. Okay, the 4 key methodologies of positivism, interpretivism, feminism and realism in relation to quantitative methodologies. I'm going to be talking about the issues of value freedom, value laden, value neutrality. I'm going to be talking about subjectivity and objectivity. And I'm also going to give some evaluative points about quantitative methodologies. So, the quantitative methodologies, I've so far talked about the definition, numerical data, gathered through methods like questionnaires, surveys, semi-structured interviews, statistical data and content analysis. I've talked about operationalization, breaking down concepts into a measurable form using indicators, like for religiosity, prayer, attendance, beliefs, dress codes, etc. Beliefs. And now I'm going to talk about the methodological ideas. So research methodologies are systems of beliefs and the views of how research should be conducted, what type of data should be used, and there is a debate surrounding this between the 4 methodologies I mentioned. The positivist view of quantitative methodologies is it's scientific, it involves testing ideas. We've got Durkheim study. Durkheim, key functionalist, sociologist. So his ontological worldview is in terms of function, consensus and order. But he's also, in methodological terms, a positivist. So he believes in the scientific study of the social world. And his study of suicide is a classic study, quantitative, statistical secondary source data on suicides, different groups on a large scale, like married or single, children or childless couples, and also looking at religion, like the difference between Protestants and Catholics, and rates of suicide. So the argument is that quantitative methods offer reliability. Reliable data is accurate because you're able to replicate information, you know that it's truthful, and an accurate measure of the reality of behaviour. Behaviour that can be measured systematically and with reliability is called social facts. So we know it's a phenomenon that's being measured consistently. And we also know about patterns and trends, the arrangement of behaviour and the changes in behaviour over time. We also know that we can find cause and effect relationships, how different variables can be measured to determine or to find out what factors can determine other factors, like how poverty can be a determining factor in crime, so it can help cause crime. And also the idea of laws, like in the natural sciences, trying to develop this sense of what are the general forces, social forces that operate upon human beings, to be able to predict future behaviour by generating these laws about human behaviour. And Durkheim developed inductive reasoning. So inductive reasoning, where you have many patterns gathered through the data collection, and then you're trying to develop a general theory to explain all of these patterns. So you're building theory from all the evidence that's gathered first. So the evidence first, and then the theory. Popper argued that this is not scientific enough. Inductive reasoning is problematic because it's not rigorous enough, it's not testing ideas enough. And so he emphasises scientific approach based on refutability. In other words, how much can you refute your ideas? So by coming up with a precise prediction or hypothesis, we're able to predict the outcome of testing. And so we should develop a hypothesis first so that it can be tested, so it's more rigorously measured. The interpretivists, people like Atkinson and Douglas, argue that quantitative methods are problematic because they offer inadequate depth. Quantitative data, like statistics, will not offer enough information about meanings. The interpretivists argue that human behaviour is a result of the definitions of meanings held by individuals in our minds, which are shared with others. And so it's the interaction between groups and the definitions in the way we see the world and our perception of the world which shapes behaviour. So the interpretivists argue that statistical and quantitative data will not be adequately measuring such meanings which are held in the consciousness rather than the reality of behaviour. We've also got the idea of interpretivists like Atkinson talking about the social construction of data. So the idea that data is socially constructed. In other words, it's culture which shapes the collection of data. So for example, Durkheim is a Western European white male. So it's his particular view of the world based on that cultural origin and social background, which will shape how he collects his data in the first place. So you can see even questionnaires, which are seen as more objective, actually are still value-laden. So that brings us to values. The positivists argue that quantitative methods offer objectivity and value freedom. In other words, we can avoid bias. The interpretivists argue that all research methods will always be value-laden. So the example of this is the Durkheim study of suicide was using data from coroners. Coroners measure suicide because they decide whether an act is a suicide or not, or a death. And so Atkinson argues that it's actually the coroners themselves are socially constructing the data. In other words, they have a flawed view of the world, and their view of what is a suicide and what is not a suicide will influence whether they record a death as a suicide or not. So even that data is not objective, the suicide rate is not a reality. There are flaws in the way we measure suicide, and that we're missing out the full picture of reality. The reason for the suicide is based on definitions. Okay, so Atkinson argued the only thing we can do is to find out the subjective interpretations of suicide and the meanings behind suicide. By talking to people about their views of suicide, we can find out the meanings attached to suicide and the definitions of suicide, and we're not able to do that with quantitative methods. So there's the idea of the social construction of quantitative methods, which applies to all data collection. Feminists argue that there's this artificial distinction between the subject and the object, which is based on a mainstream view of the world. It's based on the perspective that we have to be detached, we have to not be involved with our subject, we need to be closed in terms of our own values and not let values influence research. So that's what the positivists argue. But the feminists argue that this means that the data is socially constructed, like the interpretivists, and also you're taking a value position on research, even if you're saying that you're neutral and that you're not influencing the research with your values. The feminists would say this is still a value position. And there's someone called Alvin Goldner. Alvin Goldner argues that we should fight for the underdog, so the oppressed groups. Feminists would agree with this. They argue that women are oppressed and exploited and disempowered. Other groups, class groups and so on, are disempowered, age, ethnicity. And so the purpose of research is not to be value-free. It's not possible to be value-free, and in fact, value freedom is a political and value position itself. So even neutrality is a political position, so it's still value-laden. So feminists argue we should use our values to enhance research. They adopt the idea of fitness for purpose. So they are pragmatic, and they may choose quantitative methods in their research. For example, the pay gap might be studied using quantitative methods. But they argue using that information alone is not enough to empower people. They talk about grounding feminist theory in feminist research in feminist theory. So ground feminist research in feminist theory. So research should be grounded in the theory of, so the theory should be grounded in the evidence. And this is where we introduce the idea of inductive process of research, where we gather lots of information, we just transcribe interviews, and then we work from that evidence of how people express things in their own words, which empowers them to actually look at the wider explanation of those themes and theories. The realists would argue quantitative methods do offer strengths, but because society is an open system and not a closed system, which means that we are not able to observe all phenomena, we can't detect all the variables that affect phenomena and have relationships in the social world. And so although, so just like in the natural sciences like meteorology, seismology, we can't precisely predict the outcome of natural phenomena because of the undetectable or non-observable mechanisms at play. The realists argue that we should instead acknowledge that science itself is not truly giving observations or predictions about phenomena, or all the phenomena that exist. And so the realists argue that sociology can be seen as scientific, but it's a new view of science where it's not a paradigm that can detect and predict and measure all phenomena. So the social sciences, we try to gather a fuller picture of social life because of the problem of social construction, because of the problem of undetectable or hidden mechanisms and social forces at play in processes in the social world. And so realists advocate mixed methods. So they would use quantitative methods which offer high reliability, and the strengths of quantitative methods may cancel out the weaknesses of qualitative methods which offer depth but have weaknesses in terms of reliability. And conversely, using quantitative methods alone would have the weakness of a low amount of depth. So using qualitative methods in conjunction with this, the strengths of one method cancels out the weakness of another. And the processes of triangulation of quantitative methods and qualitative methods data, putting together the data from qualitative and quantitative methods, checking, comparing the results, will improve both validity and reliability. And this is recommended by people like REA, R-E-A-Y. There's also the Suthill and Glover Glasgow Media Group study, where they're looking at sex crimes. So again, that was going beyond a quantitative positivist framework and just looking at a range of types of information to gather a fuller picture of social life. Because there are different levels of sociality, from the level of structure, there's also hidden mechanisms at a structural level, and there's also the issue of human agency based on definitions and interpretations and labels. So you've got to combine all of that data together to get a fuller picture of social life. Quantitative methods alone will provide an inadequate and flawed picture of social life, and that's probably one of the key points that I would make overall. If you have any questions, please email Daniel_Butcher@hotmail.co.uk.